Hi, this is Michael Ostrolenk. I'm with Shahid Buttar from the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, and we're going to talk about civil liberties under Obama. Shahid, where are we today?
Not much farther forward than we were under the Bush administration, unfortunately. Whether you look at the Patriot Act, whether you look at FISA and the National Security Agency's warrantless wiretapping program, whether you look at the FBI and its unaccountability for documented abuses in the past, and now, somewhat surprising, seeking of new powers going forward. That's the story up and down the line is more surveillance, more invasions of privacy, more profiling, and quite frankly, I think for all those reasons, less security.
Can you talk about any one of those in greater details? For
Sure.
instance, the fusion centers or the FBI wanting more powers under the National Security Letter
Sure.
powers.
Yeah, the FBI is a particularly apt story at the moment, just given the movement here in D.C. There was an oversight hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee at the end of July in which the FBI was questioned by some senators about its different violations of civil rights, particularly in the context of infiltrating activist groups, infiltrating mosques. What we do know, and all that's secret, what we do know about the FBI is that its uses of the National Security Letter Authority that was extended by the Patriot Act 10 years ago has been subject to wanton abuse. There's been 3 different reports by internal government watchdogs in the Department of Justice who have found wanton violations, not just sporadically, but on the scale of tens of thousands of instances. Now, the FBI, with the White House's support, has approached Congress seeking expanded NSL powers. Now, it's characterized by the FBI as a minor technical fix, but it's anything but that. The claim now is for access, without a judicial warrant, to electronic transaction data, which is to say the FBI essentially wants to replicate what the NSA is already doing. The NSA is reading your emails. The FBI just wants to be able to know who you send them to, when, how long they are, whether there are attachments. It's all the metadata that is part of an email without seeing the content, but you can infer a lot from that, especially with all the sophisticated data mining techniques that have emerged now. So it's a profound threat to privacy by an agency that's already been abusing much lesser powers, and all Americans should be concerned.
Can you give us some background on the National Security Letters, what they are, and the authority they give to the FBI?
Sure. National security letters are kind of like subpoenas. They're requests for information from the FBI or other law enforcement agencies that were expanded under the Patriot Act. The kinds of information that the FBI can get under NSLs has expanded dramatically. So it's everything from your financial records and your bank statements to your transcripts from institutions of higher learning you might have attended, any kind of information that the FBI wants that is not a thing. Things are covered under a separate section of the Patriot Act 215, but any piece of information the FBI can go out and unilaterally get. Your call records, for instance. Now the interesting thing here is that there's no judicial warrant required. There's no check or balance. This is information that prosecutors, or in this case a law enforcement agency, can just unilaterally demand. And NSLs historically included even more objectionable components. Not only did they demand records without any recourse, but they also silenced the recipient. They had gag orders on them that prevented people from talking, whether to the press, to Congress in some cases, about the issues that they were confronting. And in fact, some of the gag orders have been, in some circuits I should say, gag orders have been ruled unconstitutional, which reflects how bad the abuses are. The last thing I'll say on NSLs is that in this year's report, the latest of 3 by the Department of Justice's Inspector General, revealed not just wanton abuse of NSLs, but the creation by the FBI with the Obama White House's support of a whole new kind of investigative tool called an exigent letter, which basically promised an NSL, a national security letter, that oftentimes never came. So you'd have bureau agents just going up to telecom providers who would be embedded in the same offices and just giving them a post-it note with a person's name on it, and then getting information about their different activities that way. And that is not consistent with the Fourth Amendment's right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. It's not consistent with the Constitution's general guarantee of privacy, and it's not consistent with security or government accountability, and all Americans share an interest in those principles.
Can you also talk about how these powers are also counterproductive to the ends that these government agencies seek, which is to protect us against terrorists?
Absolutely, yeah. There is this notion, a trope, let's say, that the intelligence agencies advance about more surveillance helping secure us. And there's a well-rehearsed set of arguments about why that's not actually consistent with our constitutional tradition. But as you're right, it's absolutely not consistent with our national security either. And here's why. To some extent, you could say that the job of intelligence analysts is to find needles in haystacks. Right? There's lots of information coming in, and look at the examples where we know that they've failed in that effort. There was the attempted bombing in Detroit, the underwear bomber in December. That person was flagged by a member of their own family who called the U.S. government, and in that case an embassy. How a report from someone's own family can disappear is explicable only in the context where analysts are inundated with so much information that they can't seize on the relevant pieces of it. And when you're looking for needles in a haystack, you don't want to just pile hay on the stack. That doesn't help. So that's one issue. There's a second issue in that the effort to gather intelligence data to feed in to these databases, and mind you, that intelligence data is often about non-criminal activity, right? It's about somebody taking photos of a particular building, or somebody seen drawing or taking notes. That sort of collection activity distracts law enforcement personnel from the more important work they could be doing, actually stopping crime and keeping us safe. The human intelligence, not driven by data mining, I think is where national security actually has an opportunity to keep us safe. And the last thing I'd say is that when you look less at the dragnet surveillance programs and then more at the profiling programs, so for instance the FBI's activities with respect to religious institutions, there's been, in fact, in that oversight hearing at the end of July, the FBI was asked about, but to this point has never publicly confirmed even the standard, the legal standard under which it infiltrates activist groups like the Animal Liberation Front or the Earth Liberation Front, religious institutions like mosques around the country. There's reason to believe, if you look at the DHS intelligence reports, that some churches might also be at risk of scrutiny here. And the FBI is going after these investigative targets with no suspicion. In the hearing, the director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, conceded that neither evidence nor even suspicion is required to trigger an infiltration activity by the FBI. And I would just invite you to think about what that leaves. If they don't have to suspect you to infiltrate your activities, and just to connect this back to where we started in the effectiveness piece, when communities are concerned that there are FBI agents surreptitiously in their midst, it diminishes the extent to which those communities are willing to share information. And it's important that as we go, we not destroy the community trust that we need for law enforcement to be effective, but rather build that trust and foster that trust, and transparency, accountability, and at the very least suspicion standards, so that infiltrations and scrutiny can be reserved for people who actually present threats rather than law-abiding people just trying to exercise their rights.
Can you also do a little background on fusion centers?
Sure. Fusion centers are relatively opaque entities. They're these regional, I don't want to call them shadow groups because that's a little bit unfair, but there are 70 of them. No two are alike. They're governed by essentially no set of legal rules. They opportunistically choose whether they're subject to federal law or state law. And they are data aggregation centers. They bring together information from local law enforcement, like the Mayberry Police Department, federal law enforcement like the FBI, private sector data sources, and if we are to believe the analysis of the NYPD in 2007, that would include then the grocery store that's scanning your purchases and flagging for scrutiny if you buy too much falafel. And that sounds like a joke, but that actually is straight out of the NYPD's report. And we know that the FBI has operationalized other parts of it, so that is as plausible a thing that they're looking for as anything else. And this is where it gets really scary, active duty military intelligence surveilling and monitoring law-abiding Americans through these fusion centers, and all of these different groups sharing information. The concern with fusion centers in particular is well, there are several. One is the administrative waste because it duplicates efforts. Again, there are 70 of them around the country. Two is the lack of transparency because nobody knows how they're collecting information. Nobody knows whether or not they're collecting information about, for instance, constitutionally protected activity. What we do know is that in at least a couple of instances, fusion centers have issued threat reports on precisely that basis. So, for instance, the Missouri Information Analysis Center and the MIAC released a report, I want to say this was early 2008, though I might have the date wrong, it might have been 2009, and it particularly invited law enforcement scrutiny and suspicion of members of the Ron Paul network, just on the basis of their political beliefs. That's insane. It's preposterous. Similarly, the North Central Texas Fusion Center, that was Spring '08, they recommended scrutiny of the lobbying activities, and I'll just note lobbying is constitutionally protected under the First Amendment, of the nation's largest anti-war group and the nation's largest Muslim civil rights organization. And the idea that the lobbying activities of any group would be suspect is preposterous, and the idea that they singled out these particular groups indicates a further problem, and that's the risk of politicization. When we look at surveillance generally, whether it's in the context of the FBI infiltrating activist groups, whether it's in the context of the NSLs, or the fusion centers, or the NSA and the warrantless wiretapping scheme, the danger here, among others, is that it grows politicized. And we've seen this problem in the past, right? The FBI, on a recurring basis, has been enmeshed in scandals in which politicized investigations, witch hunts, what the Church Committee called a sophisticated vigilante operation, targeted at suppressing the exercise of First Amendment rights. It is absolutely imperative that our law enforcement agencies and our national security establishment protect our security and not shred the Constitution. Running roughshod over our rights is not a way to keep us safe. And again, all Americans, whatever your political belief, have an interest and share an interest in defending these core constitutional, fundamental shared values.
Can you tell us a little bit about your organization and how people might be able to find out more about it?
Sure, absolutely. The Bill of Rights Defense Committee was created in the fall of 2001 to respond to the introduction of the Patriot Act. And the committee's early work centered around organizing grassroots coalitions in cities and towns across the country to, at the local level, resist the federal imposition of the surveillance authorities embedded in the Patriot Act. And it was interesting particularly because you see in 400 towns across the country an amazing coalition emerge that's generationally diverse, geographically diverse, ideologically diverse, and that diversity indicates a real strength. And so we exist to support grassroots activism to restore and defend constitutional rights eroded by the War on Terror. You can find out more about us at www.bordc, that's Bill of Rights Defense Committee, bordc.org. We'd be thrilled to hear from you, and if you share our concerns about government secrecy or surveillance, we're looking forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.